So to get to the neighborhood that I grew up in, you have to drive down this old dirt road a couple of miles and past some small farms. Right outside of the neighborhood entrance was this spooky house that was shrouded by a cluster of giant oak trees. A red and white Jeep from the 1960s sat outside, and there were never any lights on, the blinds were always closed, etc. Well, I ended up meeting the man who lived here several times. Sometimes he slowly followed me in his Jeep while I was on my bike. One time, he showed up at my house to watch me jump on my mini trampoline in the front yard and grabbed my arm. Other times, he would sit in his Jeep at 6 a.m. and stare at me while I stood at the bus stop. A creepy hand once pressed against my window screen. The entirety of what happened is in my no sleep story. I just want to focus on the two main scary occurrences. My Uncle Dave is super awesome in a really goofy sort of way. He's always playing pranks on me. He once convinced me that a hot pepper was a pickle and got me to down one at Chili's, which prompted me to wash my own mouth out with soap in the restroom. He lived in CT, and when my family moved down south to this neighborhood, we didn't see much of him. One weekend, after several encounters with the creepy guy, Uncle Dave announced that he was coming for a visit and would be staying in our guest room. My mom let me stay up late to wait for his flight to arrive. However, after seeing me fall asleep on the couch several times, she ordered me to bed and said that I could see Uncle Dave when I woke up. In the middle of the night, I woke up with this eerie feeling. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up and goosebumps covered my body. I had this uneasy feeling of being watched. Stiff as a board and trying not to move my head, lest I announce to the watcher that I was awake and aware of its existence, I moved my eyes around the room to look for anything out of the ordinary. My nightlight was on in the corner of my room, which created a pretty decent glow in my room. It was really easy to make out the details of my Beanie Baby collection, my desk, my dresser, and the man crouched next to the dresser. Okay, WTF, my little mind thought. I could see this guy with dark hair sitting with his back against the wall and his right side leaning against the dresser. His knees were pulled close to his body, and I could see his teeth and the whites of his eyes gleaming. He was facing me. I stared at him for a long time, and he didn't move. At first, I was terrified. Then I remembered. Uncle Dave, of course. He always pranks me. It's his life mission. He's probably trying to trick me again. If I cry or scream, he'll get up laughing and will shout, "Gotcha!" I can't let Uncle Dave win. I stared at him a while, and he didn't move a muscle. He never gave up the game. After what felt like hours, I felt this sense of dread fill me. As much as Uncle Dave loves pranking me, I can't picture him staying up all night long to do this weird, creepy prank. A small voice in my head tried to convince me it was someone else, not Uncle Dave. I closed my eyes and pretended to be asleep. I peeked, and I saw the man was still there. He wasn't a figment of my imagination. I closed my eyes again and imagined myself shouting for my mom and how she'd dash in and rescue me. Even if this was Uncle Dave, I wanted no part in the prank. At some point, after hours of adrenaline, I crashed and fell asleep. When I awoke in the morning, I immediately checked by the dresser and saw no one. Feeling relief wash over me, I felt firmly convinced it was Uncle Dave being dumb again. Leaping out of bed and rushing out of my room, I ran into the living room gleefully shouting, "Ha ha, Uncle Dave, you didn't get me. That was the dumbest prank ever." My mom turned to me with this weird look on her face and told me that Uncle Dave was still in CT because his flight was delayed. I figured my mom was in on the prank too and told her what happened, insisting that Uncle Dave was here. When she shook her head no, I felt a wave of horror wash over me as I tried to figure out who that was in my room. My mom told me I was just imagining things, as she wouldn't entertain me. Flash forward a bit later, I'm again in my bed. My nightlight is on. I'd somewhat forgotten about the creepy man and was more focused on stuff like Captain Planet and Game Boy. I woke up in the middle of the night to that same eerie feeling. I checked by the dresser, but I didn't see anything. Feeling relieved, I settled back into bed and tried counting sheep. While laying there, I saw a slender hand creep up the side of my comforter from under the bed. It felt around, looking for something to grab onto. At that second, every alarm system in my body was screaming, except for, of course, my mouth. I tried so many times to open my mouth and shout, but nothing would come out. I felt paralyzed. The hand was on my bed for probably only 5 minutes, but it felt like the longest 5 minutes of my life. I laid there, petrified and fantasizing about running out of the room or calling for my mom, but I couldn't get my mouth or legs to work. Instead, I lay there frozen like a wuss. I eventually was able to call for my mom, but in the middle of shouting, "Mom!" my nightlight turned off. I don't remember what happened after that, but I think I fainted from fright. When I woke up, I stood up on my bed and took a flying leap, then ran out of my room and into the living room to tell my mom what had happened. My dad checked under my bed and again told me it was all my imagination. Despite my mom trying to convince me I was crazy, I was firmly convinced that a man had been in my room, not once, but twice. After that, I would start sprinting from my bedroom door and then take a flying leap mid-room, landing with a thud in my bed. I was convinced if I didn't do this, if I walked up to my bed like a normal person, someone hiding under my bed would grab my ankles. I had a bed skirt on my bed, so it was impossible to look underneath for any creepy lurkers. As time went on, other things happened. Some person stood in the pitch black of my backyard one night and made human meowing noises at my window. Someone tapped on my window. The screen on my window had been pried open. I saw the red Jeep parked in front of our house several times. When I finally told my mom about the red Jeep, she went white and started making all of these phone calls. Apparently, the guy who lived in the dark house had been previously accused of R-wording a child, though not convicted, but was convicted of indecent exposure. The court took away his driver's license and had him registered as a sex offender. When my mom heard he was violating his conditions and following kids in the neighborhood in his car, she called the cops. The cops went to his house and ended up searching it. Inside, they found this weird wooden chair with a large hole on the seat. Allegedly, this guy would ask the neighboring farm girls to sit on the chair. He would lie on the ground underneath the chair, looking up their dresses. Sometimes he would ask the farm children to defecate through the hole and would promise gifts. One kid got a new bike out of it. Apparently all of the kids from the farms knew about this guy and his chair, but never once reported him because they liked getting free stuff. I don't know what his name is or where he is now. I tried Googling some keywords with my old neighborhood to see if anything pops up, but I couldn't find anything. I also have no idea if he was the guy who was in my room, but after hearing about him and remembering how he would follow me to my house in his Jeep, I became pretty convinced that he was the guy who had hid in my room twice. This happened about 8 years ago. I was 16 and had 2 friends living with me so they could go to college. They were from out of town and loved the beach. I live on the coast. The beach is like a home for my mom, and she used to walk on the beach and collect shells almost every day. One day we went, and my mom went to a bar that was close to where we had parked so she could have a beer. About 30 minutes goes by, and my mom still hadn't come back to the car, so we went to check on her. She was acting very weird and saying things that didn't make any sense. There was a guy with her who was obviously in a biker gang. Huge dude, by the way, tatted everywhere. Leather vest, probably 6'5", 250 pounds. I would assume the guy thought that she was alone at the bar from the look on his face when my friends and I went to check on my mom. I told my mom it was time to go, but she didn't want to leave the guy. She kept saying she wasn't leaving unless he came with us. We got staff at the bar to tell her it's time to go and that she's too drunk to drive. I didn't have a license at the time, so one of my friends had to drive. Okay, so this is where things start to get really weird. We're on the way home, and my mom keeps looking at her hands and asking us why they're moving. She was moving her fingertips around, so we were just telling her she was drunk, and they're moving because she's moving them. We didn't really think much of it. She also kept telling us she only had 2 beers. We get home, and my mom gets out of the car and sits down in the driveway. There was a child riding a tricycle across the street from us, and my mom said, "Hey, little kid, you're not old enough to have a license. You shouldn't be driving." We thought it was funny at the time because we thought she had just overdone it on the alcohol. We get her inside and put her in her bed and tell her to go to sleep. We went back to my room to play some video games and chill. About 30 minutes goes by and we hear something break, and my mom started screaming. It wasn't like a normal scream. It was terrifying. Just writing this gives me chills, thinking about how it sounded. We ran into her room, and she had broken a glass of water that we poured for her by her bed. When we got into her room, she stopped screaming and stared blankly at the wall, just mumbling shit that didn't make any sense. She would glance at us, but you could tell that her mind wasn't there. There was a blankness in her eyes, and her pupils were huge. I hadn't messed with drugs at all at this point, and neither had my friends, so at the time, we didn't think much of it. We get her to lay back down and try to sleep. Before we left the room, she was just staring at the ceiling, moving her jaw around. We went back to my room and talked about what we were going to do. We started to get scared because we knew something wasn't right. About 10 minutes goes by and we hear the car start. My friend stayed with her at the car, trying to convince her to unlock the door and give them the key. I ran down to a neighbor and I asked them to help because something was wrong with my mom. She ended up backing out of the driveway and got about halfway down the street and slammed her brakes. We were going to break her car windows, jump in, and turn the car off, but she just unlocked the door, stepped out of the car, and walked home. We drove the car back to the driveway, and I put the keys in my pocket. When we walked inside, she was sitting on the edge of her bed again with a blank stare, but was kind of twitching. We went back to my room again, and we're talking about how crazy this situation was. About an hour goes by, so we started thinking everything was calm and she was asleep, until we heard breaking glass. We went to the kitchen, and she had quietly opened the dishwasher, taken frozen food from the freezer, and grabbed a pack of computer paper. She was throwing plates at the wall and putting frozen food and computer paper into the dishwasher. When we asked her what she was doing, she just looked over at us with a long blank stare and continued what she was doing without giving us an answer. After that, we got her back to her room and I monitored her until I was sure she went back to sleep. I stayed in her room for a couple of hours and then went to my room and went to sleep. The next morning, she called me and was freaking out. She didn't remember anything and didn't know how she got home. Apparently, she had given the guy from the bar her number, and he was calling her from random numbers all morning. We went to CVS and got a drug test, just to verify that she was drugged. She had roofies and PCP in her system. When we called the bar to get security footage so we could try to find out who the guy was, they told us that their security cameras were broken. This was 5 to 6 years ago. After meeting with a couple of friends who were stationed near the bar, my friend Robin and I decided to end girls' night early, 1 a.m. I'm horrible with street names, so bear with me. We went to Rocket Bar, so you can know it was near there. We got in the car and started pulling out. We were driving a bit slow because we weren't too familiar with the area, so we didn't want to miss any turns. I had the window rolled down because when I drink, I get a bit flushed. The street we were on was a bit dead at the time. We heard a yell and some loud-ass crying. It was clearly a lady's voice, so we slowed down to see what was going on. Robin was driving, and I was in the passenger seat. On our right, we saw this lady stumble out of the street, holding her chest and crying. Robin locked the doors and cautiously rolled my window up, leaving only an inch open, thank God. The lady came right up to my window and said, "I need help." I asked, "What's wrong, honey?" And she kept repeating, "I need help," over and over again. Me, being a naive idiot, put my hand on the door like I'm about to open it, only to be grabbed by Robin, whispering, "Don't fucking open the door." The lady who had been mumbling, "I need help," repeatedly like she was slurring, saw Robin stop me, and her eyes opened wide as hell and started yelling, "I need help." We jumped and said, "How can we help?" She shoved her fingers in the cracked part of the window and screamed, "Let me in." We started yelling, "Stop that," and the lady started yanking at my door handle. Robin said, "Oh hell no," and we started pulling away. I shit you not, the next 30 seconds were fucking terrifying. The lady yelled to someone, "They're leaving," and we saw two guys run out from a car parked a few cars behind us on the right. Robin sped away like a scene in an action movie. We looked in the rearview mirror and saw the three of them standing in the street. Ladies and gentlemen, please be careful. I can't imagine what could have happened to my dumbass if it weren't for my friend. I know it's in some of us to want to help, but there are a lot of evil people out there who disguise themselves to do us harm. Be aware of your surroundings and lock your doors in DC. Last night, my friend Kay sent me a picture of a group of our friends hanging out from 2 years ago today, and it reminded me of this encounter. I'm changing names for anonymity. Kay and I had just graduated school, and we were hanging out with our younger friends before they had to go back to school for another week. James was a year behind us, and Evelyn and Mike were a year behind him. It was just the 5 of us hanging out, and we had went out for supper, and were now hanging out at a local park with a playground. It was almost dark, but still light enough that you could see all the way down the street. It was muddy, so instead of sitting on the ground, my friends each sat on one of the 4 rocking horses, tethered to the wood chips. I was the outlier, and I sat across from them on the playground equipment, about 15 feet away. We fell into a moment of silence, and Mike and Evelyn pulled out their phones. I remember looking around, and I thought I heard a man's voice somewhere behind me. "Did you hear that?" I asked. All of my friends were facing me, but the playground equipment was blocking their view, so they just looked up and shrugged. A few seconds later, I heard it again. There weren't any houses for about a quarter of a mile, and I couldn't see anybody, so it was really off-putting. James told me that I was being paranoid, and it was probably nothing. We sat there in silence for about 30 more seconds, and then I heard a stick break right behind me. I spun around, and a man wearing all black was walking behind me. I laughed and told him, "Oh, geez, you startled me." He didn't answer. I then realized that he wasn't walking past me. He was walking toward me. He picked up his speed. "Who are you talking to?" Mike asked. From their angle, my friends couldn't see the man. I looked back to point at the guy, but he had turned and was now sprinting across the lawn towards the street. Kay and Evelyn caught a glimpse of him before he disappeared into the darkness. "That guy was just here," I said. I got up and moved towards my friends. I wasn't quite sure what happened, but I had never felt so uneasy. Suddenly, a vehicle we hadn't seen on the street flipped its headlights on, blinding us, and slowly rolled down the street. It stopped right in front of the playground like it was staring at us. Another person wearing all black ran to the vehicle from the opposite direction and hopped in, and the vehicle sped off. We sat there for a couple of minutes, asking ourselves, WTF? And then decided to leave and go home. I have no idea what the hell that guy wanted, but I'm glad I'll never find out. Long story. This series of events took place about 7 years ago. I was having a smoke outside of my small duplex apartment at about 4 a.m. I worked 12s and had an odd schedule. so it wasn't unusual for me to be alone in those early morning hours when almost nobody was awake. Occasionally, I'd have a chat with my neighbor. She was probably in her early 60s, had suffered a stroke in the past. She was very sweet and didn't have anyone to vent to, so I would listen, smile, and try to be good company. She's mostly unrelated, but will come up again later. I sat there alone, smoking, square in one hand, half a blunt in the other. It was practically silent that early in the morning, which is the only reason I was able to hear some footsteps coming from the nearby alleyway. The view was obscured by some tall bushes in my neighbor's yard, but I could see a small figure approaching.
"Can I bum a smoke, bro?"
said the figure, who's finally about to turn the corner and reveal themselves. I immediately responded, "Sure, no problem." As the person comes into view, I was a bit surprised to see it was a short man. Maybe I shouldn't note these next details, but I feel I must because I feel like it adds context to the situation. If you are sensitive to the mention of race, skip forward to the next paragraph. I'm mixed white and black, and I have waist-length dreads. This guy is dark-skinned African American. I live in a small town, rural Ohio, and I am one of the very few non-white people in the area, excluding the kids from the local colleges who come from all over the world, but are rarely seen off campus or outside of the bars and whatnot, in my experience. The fellow was dressed like he was from the city or somewhere a bit fancier or more stylish and urban than what I'm used to locally. He seemed, oddly, super relieved to see me, and even more excited when he saw that I had a blunt burning. I offered to share and basically let him have the rest. We instantly hit it off, making random small talk. I have pretty serious social anxiety. I always think I sound stupid or lame when I talk, so I really just wanted to shake hands and part ways. I eventually asked him how he ended up in the alley at 4 a.m., and he had a pretty crazy excuse. Allegedly, he had come to Ohio from somewhere south. I can't remember which state he told me. I didn't care too much. According to him, they sold him the idea that rural Ohio was a wonderland of druggies, pretty much true, and he intended to come here and hustle up a small fortune. Unfortunately for him, soon after arriving to town, he went to a local bar with the two women, began flirting with other women, and the females he was with allegedly got angry and jealous. They all stormed out of the bar, got in the car, sped off, and eventually tossed him and all of his loose belongings out of the vehicle. In the short time before going to the bar, he'd also allegedly spent all of his money doing drugs instead of hustling, so he was dead broke. He also reveals that he had a history of being arrested and being shot at. He alleged that it was all based on baby mama drama and that he was the victim. I was in no position to argue, so I just listened and smiled. He told me great prison stories of defending a man, then after being released, being taught how to make meth as a favor from the defense man's brother. It all tied in with his big hustle plans. I, on the other hand, worked 12s and had a new baby, so I wasn't really about that life, anymore at least. I went through a wannabe rapper phase in the early 2000s. Before I knew it, 2 to 3 hours had passed, and he's still talking and shows no intention on moving on. I'm overly polite, so I was stuck. My now wife came out and saw what was going on. She understandably confused. She makes it awkward enough that he leaves. A few hours later, my downstairs neighbor is banging on my door. I hardly slept, so I didn't even want to answer. He tells me my friend is outside, waiting for me. So he was there and wanted to chill and chat, which a year prior I would have been fine about, and smoked him out and chilled. But I had a kid and a girlfriend and responsibilities, so it caused issues to say the least. He said he was out looking for money or a ride, trying to make calls, etc. The whole thing was shady, and I had a weird feeling about him, but he was genuinely cool towards me and treated me like he'd known me for years. I felt pretty bad for him, considering that the small town we live in can be kind of racist, suspicious, etc. And he stood out like a sore thumb, even to me, myself being among the weirdest looking, most notable person in town. Plus, I thought somehow that I was discriminating. I knew how that felt, and I wasn't going to pass it on. Plus, I knew I was his only bastion of hope. Nobody else was going to help him or let him hang around. It's a small town, there's nowhere to go, so I ignored things like, for instance, when I asked him where his stuff was. He went back to the alley and came back with a few trash bags and a big girl's purse. He said that a man saw him get kicked out and gave the bags to him. He offered the purse to me for my wife. I politely declined, but appreciated the gesture, I guess. It felt weird, but again, I was afraid I was discriminating somehow. I gave him a big luggage-type bag I had gotten as a gift years before and never used. He transferred all the stuff into the bag. I only saw a few things, like a sweatshirt. He wore the sweatshirt later that day, and it totally clashed with his style and seemed too small. I felt like it wasn't his, but I thought I was jumping to conclusions. I grabbed him some food from inside and gave him like $20 for survival and also bribed him to leave. He eventually took off in search of rides, women to stay with, money, or whatever. As night fell, it got super cold, and when I cautiously crept back out to smoke, he appeared again, like he'd been hanging around the area for a while. He looked super cold and was shivering and rubbing his hands together. At this point, I really just wanted to let him crash on the couch, but again, I had a woman and a new baby in my house, and I didn't know this dude. So I got him some blankets and Hot Pockets and snacks, and I let him crash in the garage we shared with the neighbors. Needless to say, they were surprised to find him there in the morning. This time he said he was my cousin. They didn't like it and confronted me about it. I apologized and told them the truth, excluding some important, sketchy details, because I knew they'd probably get him in trouble somehow, and I felt bad. I knew I had to work in the morning. I was not going to leave him creeping around my house with my family home alone. He was a stranger, and I wasn't going to take the risk, even though I sort of blindly hoped and trusted that we respected each other. I went online and found tickets for that day and was ready to just pay for them as a good deed and drive him to the stop. When I came out and told him, he was really thankful and thanked me so much for looking out for him. At some point, it took a weird turn, and he showed me a broken-looking security camera and offered it to me, or was trying to sell it for cash. I didn't want it and doubted it worked, and knew there was no fucking way he just legally obtained that. Still, I just wanted him gone, and I didn't want to betray him or dime him out. He left on one final search for money. I gave him another 20 or some, hoping it would keep him out of trouble. Finally, after another few hours, I heard radios outside of my window. I headed downstairs before I even heard knocking. It was the cops. Luckily for me, it was a very calm, professional officer, much unlike many I've dealt with in town. He told me that my wife's bike had been stolen, and they have it. He starts to question me about the individual. I guess when they arrested him, he described me as a tall white guy with a mohawk. I'm guessing he was actually possibly looking out for me and not trying to involve me further or cover up what came next. I think he planned on returning the bike because his possessions were still in my garage. I told the officer the truth. I told him about how I met him, how he'd been around a few days, how I gave him some money, was gonna buy him a ride home because I didn't want him around when I went to work. I didn't tell them about the stories he told me, or anything about his hustle plans, the blunts, etc. I felt I was definitely going to be accused as an accomplice. I have tattoos all over, long dreads, wore hoodies and jeans every day. I thought for sure they'd assume the worst. Luckily for me, they had already spoken to my neighbor, the woman who had the stroke, and she said I was a very nice man, that I rarely had visitors, that I'm a good dad, etc. A stellar review, to be honest. The officer said I was smart not to let him inside, and didn't ask much else. We got the bike back. He was on parole or something, and not supposed to be out of state. All of the items in the bags were stolen from my neighbors around the corner, down the alley he appeared from. Turns out the people he robbed were into drugs and stuff, and ran into him earlier to make some deal, and he came back and stole a bunch of clothes. And allegedly panties and sex toys? I'm not sure if the panties and dildos thing was true, and I only found that info out because the person he robbed was also my coworker. So yeah, don't share cigs and blunts with randos at 4 a.m. Okay, this was actually a while ago, like 3 years, and I would like to say sorry if my English makes no sense. It's not my first language. I will be translating everything from Swedish, just so you guys know. Now to the story. I was taking my daily walk with my small dog. The walk took about 40 minutes, and I was 15 at the moment. I always went out at the same time, around 6 p.m., and usually it was still sunny outside at this time, but during the winter it was quite dark. I was between a school and a football field, and was, as I could see, alone with my dog. I walked with music in one ear, and suddenly, I felt like I was being watched, and I turned my head around and still saw nothing, so I just brushed it off, thinking that the dark made me paranoid. My dog stopped to do his business as soon as I got the same feeling of being watched, just stronger this time. So I once again looked around, and this time I saw a weird man, maybe around 30 to 40 years, dark hair, and dressed in all black. He stood and leaned on one of the walls of the school and just looked at me. I quickly started walking, hoping he would leave me alone. I was too scared to look back, and because of that, I just noticed how my dog started growling. He is a small dog and usually is not aggressive at all. My dog suddenly ran behind me and stood between me and the man I saw before.
What a cute dog you have. Is he aggressive?
He said, while he was looking in my eyes and smiling. Thanks. Not usually, I answered.
A small girl like you shouldn't be outside alone in this dark.
At this point, I was almost shaking with fear, but I tried to control myself. At first, I didn't know what to answer, so I just let out a little awkward laugh.
Maybe I should walk with you. I know a wonderful way we could walk. I'm sure your dog would appreciate a longer walk, don't you think?
That's nice of you, but I can't. I need to go now. Nice to meet you. I attempted to start walking, but didn't get very far before he had grabbed my arm.
No, I insist. Come on.
This time, it was more like a demand, but he still was talking calmly. No, I can't. I need to go. I tried to make him let go of my arm, but this made him hold on harder.
No, you are coming with me. Now.
Now he seemed angry. He started to drag me with him. My dog, who moved when I started talking to the man, thinking everything was fine, came running in full speed when he heard me scream, "Let's go!" and bit the man's leg. This seemed to distract the man enough to let my arm go, and I kicked him in between his legs. And then I started running, and I did not stop until I was near my home. To be sure I wasn't followed, I hid behind a building and waited for about 10 minutes. And when I didn't see the man, I ran the rest of the way home. I did tell my parents, and we did call the police. But because no one saw anything, and the lack of security cameras at that area, they installed them 1 year later or something, they could not do much. I don't walk that way alone anymore. It confused me how quickly he became aggressive and started to drag me towards a path that goes through a small forest. For reference, I'm from Australia, female, and at the time, I was about 15 or so. This story starts with me as a teenager, living at home with my mom, stepdad Richard, and 4 siblings. Back in those days, and having 3 brothers, I was a pretty hardcore gamer. My mom was a pretty heavy sleeper since she was working full-time and caring for my stepdad, who had stage 4 testicular cancer, so I'd spend most of my nights staying up late, gaming. One particular night, at about 2 a.m., I could hear someone walking around the backyard. You know that crunching of grass, the slight shuffle of boots on concrete? The fact that the family dog Sammy wasn't barking led me to believe that it was just my stepdad. My stepdad often walked around the backyard at night to help with his restless leg syndrome that was caused by the chemo. The restless legs would keep Mom awake, so he tried to walk it off so she could get some much-needed rest. So as far as I was concerned, nothing was out of the ordinary, and I gamed on. Quite a bit later, I heard some noises in the kitchen, but again, I assumed it was just my stepdad taking painkillers or making a sandwich, which was pretty normal, so I naturally ignored it and gamed on. I eventually went to bed, and when I got up in the morning, Mom was on the phone, looking very shaken, and she motioned for me to sit down at the table. I was pretty groggy and out of it, but I started to feel a bit panicked. Mom was meant to be at work. She rarely had days off, even when she was sick, because she had 5 kids and one very sick husband to take care of. Finally, she gets off the phone and sits down. Mom tells me that during the night, someone was in her room. She said that she thought it was my stepdad at first, and the conversation went something like this. I'm paraphrasing. It was a long time ago. Mom, what are you doing? She could see someone near her chest of drawers where her jewelry box was. Him.
Nothing. Go back to sleep.
Mom, Richard, is that you? Him.
Yes, go back to sleep.
She was pretty out of it because she was half asleep, but she remembered that something about the whole exchange didn't feel right. She said that it didn't even sound like my stepdad speaking, and that she'd woken up because she heard something drop on the ground. She didn't think too much about it at the time because of how tired she was, so she rolled over and went back to sleep. In the morning when she got up, she saw that her jewelry box was on the ground and a few pieces of jewelry were missing, including priceless family heirlooms that were willed to her by her late grandmother. She went to the kitchen and saw that her phone and my stepdad's phone was missing, so using the landline, back when people still had those, she calls the police, and we later on learn the rest of the story. Our backyard faces a communal nature walkthrough type of thing. A man climbed our fence, there's a gate, but we always keep it padlocked, and walked around the house, checking all the doors to get inside, which is why I could hear all that shuffling and scuffling outside. We later learned that my younger sister had snuck the family dog in her bed that night, which is why Sammy didn't bark at the intruder. My mom's bedroom has a sliding door in the backyard, but she never locked it because she didn't see the point. The man had gotten inside through that door and must have noticed the jewelry box, but it was obviously very dark, and he dropped it as he went to pick it up, thus waking Mom up. Once they had their little convo, and Mom had gone back to sleep, he went to the kitchen and started looking for anything of value. He'd found the phones, pocketed them, and promptly left through the laundry door and over the fence. My stepdad had actually chosen that night, of all nights, to take a late-night stroll through the neighborhood to clear his head and help with the restless legs. He'd gotten back after everything had happened and was none the wiser until morning. The police told us that we weren't the only people whose house was invaded that night. Apparently, 4 other houses had been hit, and that there was a huge priority on finding the perpetrator. Funnily enough, my mom and stepdad's phones were both found in someone else's house, so they thankfully got their phones back a few days later. A few weeks after this whole ordeal, we learned that the intruder had been found. Sadly, he'd sold the family heirlooms for drug money. Dude was just a scummy meth head, but he had a gun in his possession, and it was just luck that no one was harmed with it. He was eventually sent to prison. So, on behalf of my mom, scummy meth head home invader, let's never meet again. Quick detail. This was almost 2 years ago when my husband and I just moved into a townhouse. We have our front door with a regular deadbolt lock, and our back door has, no joke, 5 different locks. Our city isn't always the safest, so we didn't question. About 1 month after we moved in, we get a knock on our door. We were confused, but maybe it's a neighbor needing something, so my husband opens the door. It ends up being a man we haven't seen before, and he said he was a maintenance man, here to fix our back door. We explained to him that we didn't call for anyone, and that our back door was completely fine. He kept insisting that he was at the correct place, and we kept insisting No, he was in fact not. What threw us off was the fact that we have not personally seen him before, and we have met most of the workers since we needed some things fixed when we first moved here. And he also wasn't wearing a uniform like they usually do. Next thing we know, he goes,
"Let me show you."
and just walks right in and heads to our back door. My husband gives me a look as in saying, "Get up and behind me," because it obviously made him nervous. The guy walks to our door and looks surprised seeing all the locks. He undoes them all and opens it for a quick second before saying,
"Oops, wrong place."
and just turns around and walks back out the front door without another word. My husband locks everything back up quick, and we literally never see the guy again. We didn't do anything as of calling the office like we should have, but we thought maybe we were overreacting, and maybe it was just the wrong place. But also, it felt like we were being scouted in some way. Sorry, I know this isn't a very crazy story, but it did creep me out a bit. I was maybe around 13 to 14 years old at the time, and I was recently granted the privilege of staying home alone. Every now and then, when I was home alone, I'd hear sounds coming from upstairs, and so I would instinctively call my mom. She then told me a story of how she used to hear things in her old house all the time, and how it was just the house settling in. Fast forward to many instances of sounds later, I decided that the very next time I was going to be home alone, I was going to be completely silent and make as little noise as possible. Within the first half hour, there was nothing, not a peep out of the entire house. I eventually got bored and felt safe, so I went to go grab the TV remote to watch some TV. But a few seconds before I grabbed the remote, I heard a huge crash upstairs and running footsteps. I was sure, more than ever, that someone was in the house. By now, there were plenty of consistent sounds coming from upstairs, that it was a fact that someone was upstairs. 14-year-old me decided to hatch a quick plan. Being the skinny, most non-threatening little girl I was, I first grabbed a kitchen knife. Then, I grabbed a shoe and propped open the front door. And after a few moments of some deep breaths, I yelled out in the deepest voice I could, "I know you are upstairs. I'm giving you a chance to leave without me calling the police, but I have propped the front door open, and I will be in the bathroom. Be aware that I'm holding a knife, and if you refuse to leave, I will call the police." Sure enough, I walk into the bathroom with my knife, absolutely scared to death that someone will open the door. I wait, and I wait, until the one sound that to this day will always scare me for this reason. I heard the front door close, and the shoe was moved. I quickly locked the door and turned on the alarm system. I hope to never see this person, or even hear this person again. This story happened when I was 12 years old. I'm a female and 25. The story I'm about to tell you might not be scary to most, but for me and my parents, it was. I remember it was a Saturday night, around 9 or 10 p.m. during summertime. I owned one dog at the time. His name is Benny. My parents decided that night that they feel like going on a walk around the block, walking Benny, and asked me whether I wanted to join them. I said no, because I wanted to play PWI on my PC, Perfect World International. My parents were okay with leaving me alone, since the walk wouldn't take longer than 30 minutes tops. As my parents would get dressed to leave the house, I logged in PWI and looked around in my guild and global chat to see if anyone was on. For some reason, no one was, so I decided to join my parents. I get dressed, I put Benny on his leash, and we all leave. I'd like to mention that I lived in an apartment building that had 10 floors, and we lived on the very first floor. Not sure how to explain it, but you have the basement of the building, and then the first row of apartments. Basically, you enter the building and already you're facing apartments. I lived in the very first one. I remember always hating that because whoever would pass by our door, we would hear them at any time of the day or night. Whoever was lurking at night, we would hear them. It was somewhat eerie to live on floor 0. Anyway, we leave the house. My dad closes the door. We had 3 keyholes and a steel bar that would block the door from the inside. The bar covered half the door. Precautions were my father's obsession. We exit the building and enjoy our walk. After 15 minutes, we realize that the wind has changed from a warm summer wind to incoming storm wind. My mom makes the call to go back home, as Benny already did all of his duties. We open the building door, climb the 5 stairs to our door, and attempt to open it. My father does the following: unlocks the first 3 locks, and then attempts to unlock the metal bar that holds the door closed. At that moment, my father pauses, turns around at us with the most serious face I've ever seen on him, and whispers to us to call the police and ring the neighbor's door. My mom goes to the second apartment, and the neighbor, who I will call Ted, comes out asking my father what happened. My dad whispered to him, covering the see-through hole of the door, "Someone is in our house. He or they are holding the door. Please stay here with my family and attempt to open it. I will be back." After saying that, I see my father rush, all by himself, around the building in the dark. I say dark because we didn't have a street light on the side of our apartment facing the block garden. My dad disappears into the darkness. I go outside too, not following him too much, but only to hear if he's in trouble. He's my dad, don't judge me. As soon as I get out, I hear him shout, "Hey, you, come back. Who the hell do you think you are? I called the police." At the same time I hear him shout, I look at Ted, who manages to open the door and enter the house. I go in after them and enter my house. It no longer felt like my house. In just 15 minutes while we were walking, the home invaders made a complete mess of our house. All of our shelves and wardrobes were pulled out, our clothes scattered all over the house. Benny's dry food was all over the floor, indicating they must have tripped in his bowls, probably not knowing we owned a dog. But what scared me the most was how organized they were. I say they because, after seeing the disaster that was left behind, we knew it was impossible for just one person to hold the door, steal, and organize what they would want to take with them. I say organized because the thieves put in our living room, all packed and ready, what they wanted but couldn't steal. On the couch, they placed our laptops, one of our TVs, my father's collection of coins, our phones, chargers, wallets, and even my father's camera. He's a photographer, and that week we had to attend a wedding. They didn't have enough time to steal all of that, so they just settled with some of my mom's jewelry and some pocket money. After seeing this in my silly child mind, I rushed to my room to check my piggy bank. I always saved up money from whatever chores I did. It wasn't much, but it was my work and savings, and at that time, I thought they stole it too. When I entered my room, I see the metal bars covering my windows are cut open and my window broken. This is how they entered, through my room. My room is the only room facing the side of the building and the one most secluded from views. Needless to say, I never felt safe in my own room, in which I had to live for the next 10 years of my life until I moved in with my fiancé. The police arrives and they start throwing white dust. I have no idea what this is still, all over our house to find fingerprints. They take pictures, take our statements, analyze my room and window. They were unable to catch the home invaders, but were able to tell us that this invasion was not the only one in our neighborhood. During that month, another 4 houses were broken into, one of them being the home of a cop, not related with the cops at our home. They told us that the invaders analyzed their victims, learned their schedule, even knew where the children's rooms were, as they seemed to be entering the houses through the children's windows. All the families affected by them had children. They didn't expect us to be back that soon and panicked. Hence, one of them was holding the door with his body so that the others could flee. The The person after which my dad was shouting was probably the one holding the door and escaping last through my broken window. I don't know what could have happened if I didn't change my mind and give up on waiting for gears and PWI. I would probably have come face to face with these invaders. I'm happy I didn't, and I hope to God I never ever meet with them. Period. I'm an avid believer in the paranormal, but if I wasn't, this building would have done it for me. I used to work in a pretty standard pub, small English town, lots of local regulars, nothing out of the ordinary. But after a while, the staff started to tell me stories. I learned it was an old Victorian house, with a family living upstairs, a woman living where the bar was, and that the cellar had once been a doctor's surgery. The deepest room in the cellar was used as a laundry room, but it had always made me extremely uneasy. I was told that this is where the old surgery was, and that there was a ghost in the cellar that didn't like women in there. They said the only way to protect yourself was to tell the ghost that you had the right to be there. I also heard that the woman who died in the bar was still there. I was uneasy, but I kept working. Nothing happened until I'd been there a few months. The first big experience. I was in the pub alone before a shift. I'd gone down to the cellar to collect bottles of drinks to refill the fridges upstairs. I then decided to go deeper into the cellar to get clean towels. On my way out, the lights cut. I heard the laundry door slam behind me and footsteps coming up behind me. They sounded so heavy, like a man. I heard heavy breathing, and I swear my heart was pounding. As soon as the footsteps stopped, the lights came on. There was nobody there, but I ran. I ran upstairs, bolted the door. I had the worst feeling. When my colleagues turned up, they said I was shaking. I remember just praying and refusing to go back downstairs. The second experience. I was in the bar with my colleague when a woman walked up to the bar. We were serving other customers, so she was in our periphery. She very clearly asked us if we could please help her. We said yes, just to wait a minute please, and she said that she'd be waiting. She walked out of the bar and into the adjoining concert room. Once I'd finished serving, we went into that room to see what she wanted. She was gone. What made it weird? That room had no other exits. She walked in and vanished. We checked the CCTV, and there was no sign, but we had both seen her. It shook me up, but unlike the first encounter in the cellar, I didn't feel scared. I felt sad. It was like she was a residual spirit, lost and lonely. I hope she managed to find peace. The third experience. This one was the second negative experience. Every area in the building had a telephone in it. The idea being that we could just call each room, as it was a huge building. The only phone that was broken was the one in the cellar because it never worked, and my boss just didn't see the point in replacing it. Nobody really used the phones anyway. I'd finished up for the day and had gone upstairs to the office. I was collecting my bags when the internal phone in the office rang. I was very surprised because there was nobody else in the building. I went to check the screen to see where the person was calling from. They were calling from the cellar phone, the only one that had been broken for years. I frantically texted the other staff. They confirmed nobody was there. I answered the phone. Nobody spoke, so I hung up. The second I did, they started calling again. I had that awful, uneasy feeling from the cellar ghost again. I grabbed my things and got the hell out. I told my boss the next day, and she checked the cellar, confirmed that the phone was still out of use. I felt really sick. That place had so many little spooky things. Doors closing, bar shutters rattling, things moving around, snooker balls rolling on their own, curtains twitching, but none of that stuck with me like these three experiences. The second one just made me sad, but the encounters in that cellar made me feel sick. I used to dread going down there. I feel upset and emotional every time I left the cellar, and would only feel safe if I prayed or if I crossed myself. I have no idea what was living down there, but it couldn't have been good. I was thrilled when I got to quit that job. I used to be a tour guide in a popular tourist town in Tennessee. My job at the time was to take people on a circuitous 2-mile walk around the town, telling them the ghost stories of the people who had lived there. During the summer, tours started a little before sundown and would end well after dark. All in all, it would take us roughly 1 to 2 hours to get through a tour, depending on the walking speed of my group. Just to preface this, the majority of stories we told were not true. They were either largely exaggerated, entirely fabricated, or simply gruesome stories of local murders, with a paranormal twist added at the end, with the ghost of the killer still lurking about. I didn't write the script, don't blame me. In fact, I visited a local museum and sourced authentic ghost stories from a curator in order to add a few of my own to the tour, which were actually authentic. That said, there were a handful of times during my stint as a tour guide in which I had experiences that were not so easily explained. In this post, I'm going to detail 3 of the most interesting ones. Story 1. One of the tools we got for our tours were EMF detectors, which I'm sure you're mostly all familiar with. They're intended to scan for electromagnetic frequencies and will detect the relative strength of a signal they pick up. Now, just because one of these things goes off doesn't mean you're seeing a ghost. They also pick up power lines and will go off like crazy near a generator. But if you're in the middle of nowhere and you suddenly get a strong signal, it's worth looking into. Now, these detectors we used had about 5 lights on them, changing in hue from green to yellow to red. Red meant no signal, and green indicates a strong signal. The light never goes below red unless you turn the thing off. That's the baseline. At the end of our tour, we would come to an old graveyard, nobody buried in there in at least 100 years. After I did my thing with the final story, people would wander around and look at the graves with flashlights and scare themselves shitless. But one night, as they were wandering, a man came over to see one of the graves. I went over and had a look, and I saw what the problem was. Whenever he passed his EMF director over this particular grave, all the lights would turn off. The entire machine would turn itself off when it was over the grave and turn back on as soon as you moved it away. We tried with a couple other graves, but only this one had the effect. We were curious about this grave, so we tried to read the name of the person, but the headstone was too worn down for us to read it. The first name, Thomas, was faintly able to be read, but the surname was too hard to read. We had the whole group, 5 people, leaning over it at this point, trying to read it, when we all heard the same thing. As one of the group wondered aloud what the man's surname was, a loud voice from behind us shouted,
Whaley.
As you may have guessed, there was nobody behind us when we turned around, and we called the tour to a close shortly after that. I never messed with that specific grave again, except to place some flowers on it one time, as it was my habit every once in a while, since nobody visited that place anymore. Story 2. At the end of the tour, sometimes I would get tips if people had fun, got spooked. Older boomer and Gen X men really enjoy the charade of the covert handshake tip, where they palm you the money as they shake your hand. I always indulged a bit because, hey, I was getting a tip. One tour I ran had a family of 3, mother, father, daughter, and an older man who I initially thought was Grandpa, but later learned had been lumped into their group because we didn't run solo tours. The old guy was pretty quiet throughout the tour, but would occasionally ask very pointed questions that stood out to me as odd. I don't remember most of his questions anymore. This was years ago. But one example is that I was telling a story of a girl who fell from a balcony, and her ghost haunts the river she plummeted in to this day. And he asked me if I thought she died right away when she hit the ground, or whether I thought she died slow and suffered. Just weird things like that. Well, at the end of the tour, the family took off into the graves to have a look about, see if ghosts would show up in their pictures, etc. Old man comes to give me that typical handshake, and mentally, I was thinking that all his weird behavior could be easily forgotten if he tipped well. The handshake was normal, except that his hand was ice cold. But old folks have cold hands, so I didn't think about it too much. Except, he didn't palm me $1, he palmed me a coin. I thought it was a $50 when I felt it at first, but it was too big. I turned to glance at the guy as he walked past me to leave, and I shit you not, he was just gone. The path leaving the graveyard was downhill, and you had visibility from the top for at least 300 feet. There was no way he could have covered that distance in that time, and I didn't even hear running. Just this old, tottering man in front of me 1 second, and gone in the blink of an eye when he walked past me. When I got home, and I looked up the coin, 1 troy ounce silver bullion, minted to an older year. I don't remember exactly. I can check the year when I get home this evening, if anyone cares. Overall, the experience left me a little shocked, and the family agreed. He was really odd when I walked them back to their car. Apparently, the guy greeted their daughter by name when they arrived at the meetup spot a few minutes before me, but they had no idea who he was. Story 3. So 2 weird experiences, but no ghostly apparitions or demonic screams. Unfortunately, most nights on the ghost tour were entirely mundane. However, I have got one more odd story I experienced, which really set my belief of ghosts in stone. One of the earlier stops in our town was an old cabin where the town's progenitor once lived. The cabin has been moved around a couple of times to build parking garages, but has since been placed back in its original spot. We don't actually have a photo of the woman who founded the town, but we've got pictures of her granddaughter, who everyone at the time swore was a dead ringer for her grandmother. Because of this, an old black and white photo of her granddaughter is on the sign outside of the cabin. The cabin is kept locked with a padlock at all times, except when the Historical Society opens it for school groups. The windows are so dirty you can't see inside. And most of the time, it's too dark to get a decent look inside. Anyway, regardless, I like to encourage people to peek through the cracks in the old wood, because they'd psych themselves into thinking they saw something move. And a spooky tour is a tour with good tips. Anyway, one night after I did the whole spiel about her founding the town, and how people say they can see her ghost within the cabin on some nights to this day, I let them all have a go at peeking inside. One of the younger teens in the group approached me after looking inside, and we had a very odd conversation. These kids, 13 to 16, usually think it makes them look cool to be skeptical and show everyone they're not scared. So he asked me something like, "Who's in the costume?" I was a little confused and explained how the photo on the sign is a picture of the granddaughter of the town's founder, but that she wasn't wearing a costume. That was how people dressed at the time. The little shit rolled his eyes and told me he meant the woman in the cabin. Of course, I had to have a look, so I peeked through, and sure enough, a streetlight was shining through the dirty windows and letting in a diffused sort of light, and you could just make out a figure in a rocking chair sitting in the corner of the dark cabin, rocking back and forth. It was hard to get a good look at her, but from what I saw, she did look just like the woman in the photo. I moved the group on pretty fast because, quite frankly, I was a little afraid it was a homeless person who'd broken in somehow. If it was, I had a group of 6 kids and 1 parent, homeschoolers, I think. I didn't want anybody getting hurt or snatched. But I stopped by the cabin again on the way to my car, and the lock was on tight and undamaged. I peeked in again, and there wasn't even a rocking chair in the cabin. In the whole time I worked the tour route, roughly 2 years, I never saw a chair in that cabin again, or any old woman, for that matter. So anyways, those are my stories. I know they aren't as sensational as some, but I thought I'd share my experiences with you all. I have a few more odd stories that I can share if you'd like, but they're all more explainable by mundane means, if not still creepy and odd. I've had a few paranormal experiences in my life, but this is probably the weirdest of the bunch. I'm in my early 40s now, but when this happened, I was 14, and it was the summer of 1995. It was in the late afternoon, around 4 p.m., and still very light. I was stood near the back door in the kitchen of my mom and dad's house. My dog was stood in front of me, and I had just put some scraps from my tea in his bowl. Suddenly, he lowered his head, bared his teeth, his hackles stood up, and he growled. He was a wire-haired fox terrier Jack Russell cross, but he was not food protective and was usually very placid and mild, so this was very unusual behavior for him. I stood up straight and noticed my shadow on the wall near the door getting darker until it was so beyond black it was devoid of color. I realized my dog was not protecting his food. He was scared. The shadow then stepped away from the wall as a fully 3D being and was only feet away from me. My dog ran away, but I was frozen with fear. Back then, I was around 5'4", and this thing was the same height as me. It had no facial features and a smooth outline. It had shape and form, but at the same time was so dark that it seemed like a void. It had no eyes that I could see, but I got a sense that it was looking at me. This being and I stood and stared at each other for what felt like 5 minutes, but really must have been mere seconds. I was terrified, and it seemed shocked that I could see it. It then raised its arms up, so its hands were above its head. Then it shot up into the ceiling, into a puff of smoke, the same color as the being. The smoke dissipated as soon as it had appeared, and I could move again. I had no idea what I'd seen, as I'd never heard of anything like a living shadow. Also, I didn't know anyone who had seen something like that. At the time, the internet wasn't what it is now, and we didn't even have a computer to access it anyway. I spent many years worrying that I had some kind of mental illness or something. Then, years later, I found a website where other people had written about their experiences with these shadow people. In the past 10 years, I've heard a lot of people talking about them on various podcasts. I don't know what they are, and I'm not going to pretend that I do. All I know is, I saw something that I don't understand. Other people in my family have seen the shadow person, but only in glimpses. I have seen another since, at a friend's house, and though creepy in comparison, that one was nowhere near as scary. For reference, this story took place around 6 years ago. At the time, I was an 18-year-old girl with a lot of home problems. I had been dating my boyfriend for around 2 years by this point. He was Austrian and I was American. Due to our long-distance relationship, we decided that once I turned 18, we would start our gap year of traveling and working weird jobs in between. Since I was in a super toxic environment, I decided to go to Europe for an indefinite amount of time. I got a job as an au pair in Rome, and my boyfriend and I moved down to Italy to live there for 2 months. The story takes place in Rome. Shortly after settling into my new family's house, I left their house to meet up with my boyfriend. Since I had just gotten there, I didn't even worry about my cell phone, and so figuring I can rely on public Wi-Fi, I didn't purchase a SIM card right away. Bad decision. The location that we were meeting at was around a 25-minute walk away from where I was living, and since the public transport was not reliable, I decided I could walk the way with a downloaded map of Rome. I, anyway, wanted to see Rome in the night and how it lights up and becomes literally abandoned. Coming from New York, I was not used to a major city actually becoming quiet and resting for the night. I was starting to get a little sketched out after 10 minutes or so of walking through the empty old streets. Following the map, I was led to a strange-shaped pyramid building, and walking behind it, I was slowly gaining the sense that I was no longer walking alone. I started a speed walk to at least be on the sidewalk of a street and not behind a dark building with no lights. When I reached the sidewalk, I had that terrible feeling that comes over you when you know you're in actual danger. I turn around to find a 50-something-year man walking around 20 feet behind me. I quickly started to pick up walk to a fast-paced one, and when I turned around again, he had already cut the distance in half and was sprinting to me. The look on his face was pure rage, anger. At this point, I started booking it and running as fast as I can. Hearing the footsteps behind me sprinting is still a haunting feeling to this day. I ran ahead to a busy street and ran across to the other side. Out of breath and crying, I stood watching the man across the street try to cross, but fortunately for me, the light turned green and the cars were flowing, so he couldn't cross. He began to scream and just have an utter meltdown. He was just outraged. I fled at this point, ran as fast as I could to a bridge nearby, where thankfully my boyfriend was at. Since I took so long to get to the meeting point, he began to ride his bike to come and meet me. I hopped on the bike seat while he stood up and pedaled, and we got out of there fast. I don't know what his intentions were, and I'm glad I never found out. So to every person out there, avoid all the faults and mistakes I did. Never leave without a charged working phone. Try to avoid dark areas, unpopulated areas, and the moment you feel like something isn't right, it probably isn't. So about 6 years ago, I was the ripe age of 21, and I was home from college for the summer and living with my parents. This is deep Texas suburbia, so the houses are all cookie-cutter houses, built around the same time by the same developer. Every few blocks, there's a pool or a park of some sort. Well, every year, the community people, I honestly don't know how this gets organized or by whom, have a Rock the Park event at one of the pools or parks within walking distance of my house. Some old guys bring their garage bands and cover songs by Aerosmith and the Eagles, etc. The pool stays open late. There's a playground, and you can hear the music from every corner of the park. It wasn't too loud though, unless you were nice and close. Well, my parents went on a dinner date that night, so I decided, with my 21-year-old brain, to pour some vodka into my Coca-Cola bottle and walk up to the park for some tunes and a good time. It's only about a block away from me, so I get there pretty quick and down a good amount of my vodka along the way. I'm feeling pretty good by the time I get there, so I head right up to the closest bench to the stage. They were just standing within some cones and speakers on the grass. There's a person sitting on the far edge of the bench, but I don't really pay attention to him at first. There's a good 4 feet of empty bench between us. It didn't take long, however, for him to strike up a conversation. He had a bony face and looked to be at least 30. He said hello, how are you, etc. I was polite back, but pulled out my phone to fuck around, so he might get the message that I don't really want to talk. He asks if I'm having a good time, and like a fool, I tell him that of course I am. I'm a couple shots worth of vodka in. I shook my Coke bottle, and the small amount left in it fizzed. That's when he started to ease his way in. I stayed on the far edge of the bench, but as he kept talking to me, he kept moving closer. He asked if I lived around here, and I said yeah, don't worry, I walked. I honestly thought he was asking, because I was not sober enough to drive. He told me he lived in some vague direction, and then asked if he could have my number. I started getting uncomfortable because for the first time in my life, I was alone somewhere and in a compromised state. I told him I didn't know him that well, and he said something like,
Okay, well, get to know me.
I told him I needed to walk around because the music was too loud, and I had to make a phone call. I ventured to the other side of this large playground equipment with lots of climbable walls and tubes. I make sure he can't see me, but I know he watched where I went. I texted a bunch of my friends from college telling them what was going on and asking for advice. They told me to leave, but I knew that he could see me and I didn't want him to follow. I started hitting up my friends from high school, hoping some might be home for the summer already, and luckily one of my friends was. I told her what was happening, and I asked if she could come save me. She said she could, but she couldn't make it for another 20 to 30 minutes, which was still well before the event ended. I went over to a different part of the playground where the swings were, and I took a seat where I could see the stage, hoping maybe he'd forget about me and leave me alone. Sure enough, the moment I sit, he's approaching the swings. He takes the one next to me and starts trying to be like,
"What did you want to know about me? What do you need to know?"
I was like, actually, I'm getting really tired. I'm probably gonna go home soon. I just want to enjoy the music a bit longer without talking. That was when he became adamant about walking me home. It was a suggestion at first, but the more I told him no and that I'd be fine, the more aggressive he got about it. My parents wouldn't be home for another few hours, so if I did go home and he followed, he'd know where I live and have me alone. He asked which direction I lived in, and I pointed to the opposite direction of my parents' house. He got up and he took a few steps in that direction, then turned back to me like he expected me to follow. I told him that I wasn't ready to go home, but it became very clear that if I was walking home that night, he was coming whether I wanted him to or not. He stayed near me for the next 10 minutes or so until my friend arrived. I saw her car pull up and immediately got to my feet like, "Hey, that's my friend," and I sped off towards her car. She parked and got out and started heading back towards the park. I was like, "No, hey, we gotta go now," but it was too late. He followed me and touched my shoulder. He said,
"Hey, wait, you promised to give me your number."
I hadn't, but I felt rather trapped and figured that if I gave him a fake number, he'd be satisfied enough to let me leave. Sure enough, immediately after I spouted off, he calls it and starts looking at my phone, expecting it to ring. That's when my friend goes, "Hey, Thorhees, didn't your phone die?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, I forgot. I'll get you later, man. Text me." And I waved to him, and we both sped walked back to her car. He didn't follow, but he watched us drive away. I told her to go the opposite direction of my house and to take the long way around. So, to the guy who killed my rocking park vibes and my confidence in being out in public alone, let's not meet. So about a year and a half ago, I was 16. I'd taken a job of babysitting my aunt's dog in the Bronx while she was away on business. I don't exactly know the breed, but this dog was a powerhouse, more than capable of taking someone down. Her name is Dolly. I had to introduce myself to her in my aunt's presence to ensure she knew who I was before showing up alone later. I was told to walk her about 4 times a day. She's very well trained and doesn't bark really, which is what makes this encounter more creepy. It was late, like 2 a.m., and she adorably woke me up for a walk by digging her nose into my arm. When we began our walk, it was really dark out. You wouldn't be able to see anyone's face from a few feet away. The streets were empty, but that's expected at 2 a.m. In this suburban kind of area in the Bronx, the sidewalks are very narrow. You can't walk down it in twos. Dolly was slow because she liked to smell literally every molecule on the sidewalk. Here's the creepy encounter. There was a man who was walking down the same sidewalk as us, maybe about 10 feet behind. Dolly went off the sidewalk to where the grass was to sniff a treat. I knew with her that could take years to be done, so I kind of signaled the man, who was a lot closer now, to go on by, and I stepped off the narrow sidewalk onto the grass. And I was right. Dolly took forever sniffing this treat. Genuinely think it was about 10 to 15 minutes. I didn't have a problem with it taking long because I was listening to good music with AirPods, and watching her go around this tree was an enjoyable sight. Then, all of a sudden, Dolly begins barking ferociously at something behind me. It startled the crap out of me because it was so abrupt, and I hadn't ever seen her bark like that. I quickly turned around to see what would make her do this, and there was the same man. He hadn't gone any more forward in the direction he was coming in since I signaled him to pass me, still about 5 feet away. He wasn't on his phone. He was standing there just looking at me. Dolly was going crazy at him, and he had little to no reaction. Now I got a closer look at him. He was very tall, taller than me, and I'm 6'3". He was bald, and his face was expressionless, although half of it was covered by the darkness of the night. I realized that the dude must have just stood there staring at me for 10 to 15 minutes. He definitely wasn't trying to talk to me in that time, because my music wasn't that loud. I would have heard him, and I don't think he was admiring the dog, because even with her barking, his eyes were zoned in on me. We had about a 10-second moment of staring each other in the face. Normally, I would have asked him if he needed something, but I just had the worst feeling ever. He right away reminded me of the dancing tall smiley man creepypasta story, which I think was the cause for my fear in the moment. I turned from him, and I felt safe with this ginormous dog. I took my AirPods out of my ears so I could hear if he followed. Dolly walked with me, but her eyes stayed on him the whole time. Instead of continuing down the same street, I crossed the block. As I started to do this, I shit you not, this man absolutely sprinted in the opposite direction he was originally heading in. The sound of his feet rapidly hitting the floor sent an uppercut to my guts. I quickly turned around and watched him do this. He ran as if his life depended on it. I watched him run till he turned the corner and was out of view. I held Dolly's leash tight and hurried back to the house. I don't think he followed, but Dolly kept looking back and growling. When we got back, I locked the door and made sure Dolly slept in bed with me. So this happened to me a couple of years ago when my now husband and I were living in a townhouse in a pretty decent area. My husband was working third shift as a corrections officer at our local corrections facility, and I was working as a waitress and bartender. It was an unusually warm night for mid-March, so I took advantage and decided to take my husband's 80-pound Alaskan Malamute Siberian Husky mixed dog on a quick walk around the neighborhood near our complex. We get to the end of the street that leads into the complex we live in, and across the street is a Marathon gas station. I noticed as the dog, Luke, stops to relieve himself that there's a guy across the street at the gas station with a case of beer in his hands. I had my phone out texting a friend, and I looked back up to notice the guy was near the stop sign, also relieving himself on the sign. I felt really awkward and instantly put my phone away and led Luke down the street on our path. At this point, I think the guy noticed us, and he crossed the street to where Luke and I had just been. I hear him walking a few feet behind me and just keep my head down, staring at my phone, with Luke glued to my hip. After about 10 seconds, I hear this guy's steps getting closer. Luke realizes there's someone behind us, and he stops in his tracks. Mind you, he's a big dog compared to my 5'2" self, but I can handle him pretty easily, and he is very well trained by my husband. But I noticed his ears were perked up, and his tail was straight up. I was glad that he was aware of our surroundings, but I still wanted to keep moving and get away from this guy. I don't know, I just got a weird feeling. This guy finally catches up, so I tighten my grip on Luke's leash and pull him closer to me and step into the grass to allow this guy to pass us and keep Luke out of his way. Does this guy keep going and pass? Nope. When I thought he was about to pass us, I stuttered out a small apology because Luke was pulling on his leash a little to investigate this guy, and most people did get intimidated by him just by his size. He is massive for a dog, in my opinion. The guy stops and just stares at me for a minute, long enough for me to smell the cigarettes and booze rolling off of him, and to notice he's probably in his mid to late 20s, dark hair, scruffy looking, and just dirty. He smiles, and then finally seems to notice Luke trying to get at him and asks,
Cute dog, what's his name?
Instead of making up a name, I said, Luke. He then proceeds to ask me if he can pet my dog, and before I can even give him an answer, he leans down to start petting Luke's head. Luke did not like that. Luke jumped at him as a warning, and the guy backed up, chuckling. I apologized and mentioned that he was very protective and made up a lie that he was trained as my dad's former canine unit. My dad is a software developer. Instantly, I saw this guy's face change. I don't know what to call it, but he looked a little put off by it. He asked me what my name was, and I gave him a fake name. He then asked if I lived around here, and I said I was visiting a friend of mine for the weekend. He then made a sudden step towards me, and I'm not lying when I say I have never heard my husband's dog growl in the 5 years I've been with him. But the sound that came from my dog sounded like something from nightmares. Luke's hair was spiking on his spine, and he was throwing himself up on his back legs and kicking his front legs at this guy. He had put himself completely between myself and the guy and snapping at him. This freaked the dude out so much he stumbled backwards, nearly dropping his beer. He quickly said,
"Well, have a nice night, cutie."
"Ew," and stumbled off down the road. When I say my heart was pounding, it was deafening. I grabbed Luke's leash so hard and sprinted between the buildings until I got back to my townhouse and locked all the doors and collapsed by the front door. Luke was in my face the whole time, kissing me and whining. This dog is the sweetest and most gentle creature I've ever met, and hearing him growl and seeing him react the way he did made me realize that I needed to get out of that situation, and fast. 2 things I learned that night. 1, do not go out at night alone, even with my dog, because if someone wanted to get to me, they would take my dog out without a care. And 2, always listen and read your dog. If they think something is up, then trust their instincts over your own. This was a good 6 months back. My girlfriend was staying at her parents', so I, 27 male, was at the flat alone. Around 3 a.m., I'm woken by a loud slam. I quickly jolt up. My bedroom door is wide open, and I see a bald man walk straight past my room and into the living room. I must have forgotten to lock the front door that night. I jumped out of bed, and immediately my mind made the decision to just stand in front of the front door. I figured there's only one way out, and if he's taken anything, I can try to stop him. In my haste, I'd also made the subconscious decision not to put any clothes on so I could get to the door quicker, and so I was standing there completely naked. Not important to the story, just semi-amusing. Anyway, the dude comes stumbling back to the door, has a handful of loose cans of Stella cradled in his arms, a half-smoked cigarette in his mouth, and a plastic shopping bag hanging from one of his hands. I asked what he was doing in my flat, to which he replied,
"I'm really sorry. I'm so sorry."
Though he could hardly get his words out. He was clearly absolutely fucked. I asked him to show me the contents of his bag, which didn't have any of our stuff in it, before proceeding to let him out of the flat, locking the door this time. I'm assuming he was just out of his mind on whatever and walked into the wrong flat. One funny detail, there was a point where one of the cans slipped from his grip, and he had to bend down to pick it up, making him directly eye level with my bare waist. It was a very awkward moment, and I'm sure the poor guy doesn't remember, so hasn't been completely scarred. Anyway, I got back to bed and could hardly sleep the rest of the night, my heart absolutely thumping. I will say, it gave me some confidence in my fight or flight response. You never really know what you'll be like in this sort of situation, and I was quite proud after the fact that I blocked his exit. I'm perhaps not one of the most masculine of men, so that was some nice affirmation. Completely true story, by the way. One of the most terrifying moments of my life. Seeing a stranger casually stroll into my living room in the dead of night. A good lesson for kids about stranger danger. This was 4 years ago. I was 15, and I loved puzzles. I wanted to buy one, but I didn't have much money, so I went out with my sister, who was 12 at the time and short for her age, looking for random toy stores that sold off-brand and cheap toys. We found one in an area of town that didn't have much activity around. It didn't really look like a toy store in the front, and when you walked in, You could see the shelves full and look like they haven't been rearranged in years. It kind of seemed like the store didn't really have a reason to be there. There was this man at the cash register who noticed us coming in. I didn't really get a weird vibe from him or the store. It was just empty. So we looked around and there are no puzzles. So I go up to the man and I ask him, "Hey, I can't seem to find any puzzles. Do you know if there are any that I'm missing?" The man answers,
Oh yeah, there are puzzles. They're downstairs.
I didn't see any downstairs when we entered the store, but I was like, sure, show me the puzzles. This was like the third store we had tried, so I just wanted to find my toy, you guys. The man walks around the corner and to the door that you wouldn't notice unless it was pointed at. He opened and revealed a steep staircase going down. At the bottom was a plain wall. You would have to go left or right to enter whatever the room was. It didn't seem like there were toys down there. It was also kind of dark down there. Also, if there was really a downstairs to the toy store, wouldn't the door be open? At that moment, I got that stomach drop and the get the F out of there, man, feeling. The man was looking at me, waiting for my sister and I to walk down in front of him. I was like, my mom is calling me. I'll be right back. My sister and I got the heck out of there, and I've never even been close to the store since. Maybe there were puzzles down there, maybe there weren't, but I was definitely not going to stay and find out. Also, it's very important to be careful in this sort of situation, because if I was right, and the man did have bad intentions, then if I had taken even just one step closer to the stair, he could have pushed me down, and at that moment, there would have definitely been no possible escape. So don't go down random stairs, y'all. Stay safe. I have a couple memories of being abroad at various times that I didn't think about at the time that could have gone bad, but didn't turn out that way. When I, 25 female, was newly 16 in 2011, I went to China on a 10-day trip for high school students, sponsored by our local Midwestern university. On one occasion, we were in a large market on the basement level of a shopping center in Beijing. I can't remember exactly where. We were supposed to be using the buddy system, and I was buddies with a boy I've stayed friends with over the years. While looking around the large market, we got separated for a few minutes visiting different stalls, but I just assumed my friend was close by and could see me. I walked into a shop stall by myself to look at some of those tacky souvenir canvas bags that you can find in any major city. I browsed for a couple of minutes, not paying attention to the fact that I was the only one in the stall when a small, middle-aged Chinese woman came up to me and grabbed me tightly around the arm. In broken English, she told me she had more purses and bags in her secret shop and started pulling me towards the back of the store. Taken aback, I said I didn't want to look. In front of me, a man was pushing open a door at the back of the wall that had bags hanging all over that would have appeared to be part of the display. I just remember being incredibly confused and hesitant. She was holding onto my arm so tight it hurt while pulling me forward, and I just remember in that moment looking around quickly. Then I see my 6'2" tall male friend running over. He came and grabbed my other arm, and when she saw him, she immediately let go, walked off, and the man shut the door. I don't know exactly what was going on, but I do know that I was very young and naive at that time, and that I'm very fortunate I had a watchful friend. When I was 20, I spent a semester abroad in Copenhagen. I lived in a house in a suburb just north of the city, and I had spent the evening having some drinks with friends in the city center. I was the only friend who lived in that direction, so I got on the S train by myself. I did this every day to get to and from class. A male friend offered to go with me, but I didn't want to inconvenience him with an extra trip, so I declined. The train ride was 20 to 30 minutes, and at the second stop, a dark-haired middle-aged man sat down across from me. Even though I had been drinking, I wasn't drunk, and by this point in my life, I had learned how to just be a little more careful of my surroundings. I busied myself with my phone, and he asked me how I was in Danish. Many people assumed I was because I'm pale and blonde. My barely possible Danish was even worse if I had any alcohol, so I apologized and said that I only spoke English. In choppy English, he said that he was Spanish and didn't speak much English himself. I just smiled and nodded, hoping he would understand that we couldn't talk. However, he kept trying to ask me questions, though. I decided to be polite and ask how he was doing in my incredibly poor Spanish. He took that as an invitation to ask more questions, and I could barely understand a thing. He was visibly frustrated I couldn't converse with him, and then tried to ask if I was with friends or if I was from here. Subtle red flags. I thought about getting off the train early, but I didn't want to get lost. I had only been there a few weeks at this point. 10 minutes later, I got to my stop and got off the train. I very much noticed he also got off the train just before the door closed. Usually, I walk home. It was a 15-minute walk from the station to my house, and on normal days, it was a pleasant walk through a residential neighborhood. He followed me through the tunnel under the tracks to the other side, and luckily a city bus was outside the station. I immediately got on, showed the driver my pass, and sat right behind him. It was late at night, and I was the only one on the bus. The driver must have been perceptive and understood something was amiss, because he looked at me and asked in English, not Danish, where my stop was. I told him, and he closed the door right after. As the bus pulled away, I saw the Spanish man standing outside the station, staring at me through the windows. He turned away and walked back through the tunnel under the station towards the platform. Both experiences were a combination of good timing and understanding people, but it is frustrating to think that I should have, had the help of a male friend in these scenarios. The world isn't a friendly place. I used to live in Orlando in a somewhat shady part of town. The 5 deadbolts on the apartment door should have raised some red flags, but I was a student, and there were a lot of students in the area, and I was young and not yet wary. Our less nice part of town bordered a very nice part of town. There was a 4 to 6 lane road that ran through the area, and a jogging path that ran alongside of it. Our apartment complex was right next to the road and the trail, and a little further down was my local gas station, where I would walk once a day to buy cigarettes and other things. Because of the layout, it was easy for me to walk out my door, step on the path, and walk the 10 minutes to the gas station. Walking through the complex took longer. I often ended up taking this walk at night. Sure, I was a girl walking alone, but the path bordered this huge road with a lot of traffic, and right across the street was a busy strip mall with fast food places and such. So it wasn't like a dark path in the woods or anything. And hey, I always brought pepper spray, paid attention to my surroundings, etc. So one night, I head to the gas station around 11 p.m. As I'm walking along the path, I hear something behind me. Turning around, I noticed about 30 yards behind me, there is a car on the trail. Like, it had to have pulled off the road and pulled up onto the path. I'm stopped and staring, and a guy gets out of the driver's side and starts walking around the grass between the trail and the road, as though he's looking for something. Oh, I think. Something must have fallen out of his car, and he's pulled over to search for it. I keep walking. As I'm walking, I hear something again behind me. I stop and turn. Guy is now 15 yards behind me, still no headlights, and I turn as he stops the car. Or he stops the car as I turn. Again, he gets out, and it looks like he's searching for something in the grass, but he's closer now, and I'm a little creeped out. I'm not close enough to the gas station, so I pick up the pace. The next time I turn, he's even closer. He stops again when I look, but he doesn't get out of the car now. I don't want to just take off to let him know he scared me, but I am now power walking. My pepper spray is in my hand, but what does pepper spray do against a car? I throw a look over my shoulder, and he's only a few yards behind me. He doesn't stop this time. The distance is closing. Fuck it. I take off. I judged the distance to the gas station to be too far along the trail, but there are some trees and stuff on the other side of the path from the road, so I bolt into them, and through a little ditch towards the light of the station, which is now right in front of me. I felt like the dude in the car was going fast. I look behind me as I'm running through the ditch, and I see him through the space in the trees. His car slows down, and he's just cruising along the section of path I left. I continue my sprint to the gas station, where I know I'll feel safe. The owners and employees all know me. I made it out in front, and I'm catching my breath, watching the part of the jogging path that meets the intersection. I see the car clearly for the first time. It's one of those brown car-truck combos, with a tan stripe along the side. Dude drives up the trails to the intersection, flips his lights on, and floors it onto the main road, disappearing. Up until that point, I was running on a mix of adrenaline and feeling that maybe I'm being stupid, but better safe than sorry feeling. Once I had made it inside the gas station, I pretty much broke down shaking. To this day, I still don't know what that guy's intentions were. Maybe he didn't even see me and was just looking for something. Maybe he was planning to hit me with his car and drag me off. Maybe he was an asshole that was just trying to scare me. Either way, I had my boyfriend come get me from the gas station, and I never walked alone at night again. Alright, so this takes place a couple of years ago. I was about 16 to 17 years old, 22 female now. I used to work at a well-known fast food restaurant. I typically had to work the closing shift since I had school earlier in the day, so by the time I got home, it was around 11:30 p.m. I had my own car this time, and when I got off work, I used to like to sit in my car, recline the driver's seat back, listen to music, and just chill out. I used to do this because I have helicopter parents, so this was the only real alone time I got without being hovered around. Well, one particular night, I was exhausted. I got stuck with the slow closers, so I got home a little later than normal. I started up my normal routine of sitting in my car, but instead of listening to music and scrolling through my phone, I leaned back and closed my eyes. I didn't fall asleep or anything. I was just listening to myself breathe while taking in the silence of my own company. I don't remember how long I was laying back with my eyes closed, but suddenly I bolted up and saw my mom with an angry face waving frantically at me. She was gesturing at me to come to her immediately. I sighed, and I hurried out of the car towards her. I would like to add, my parents liked to drink, so she was pretty inebriated when I approached her. She grabbed me by the shoulders and hissed, "Who is out here with you?" Confused, I shook her off. "No one, Mom. I was just sitting in my car by myself before I came in." I remember feeling a little annoyed because I thought I was going to get in trouble, but her face soon turned from angry to concerned. "What? Someone was out here. They were looking at you through your window. I came out here because I had a funny feeling, and when they saw me, they took off into the neighbor's yard." She was slurring her words together terribly and was visibly shaking. Being the teenager that I was, I just rolled my eyes and took her inside. I just thought she was a drunk, overprotective parent who got worried that I wasn't inside the house at my normal time. The next morning rolls around. I do my normal school routine, kiss my parents goodbye, and as I'm unlocking my car door, I notice something that stops me, dead in my tracks. I felt a cold sweat creep up on me with a chill sliding down my spine. A forehead and 2 forearm prints were on my driver's side window. I never sat in my car after work again after that. I think about it from time to time, about what would have happened had my mother not come outside to check where I was. Were they looking into my car to break into it? Did they notice me completely defenseless and try to scare me? I have no idea, but I'm glad I never found out. Hello everyone. I work out in the country and take back roads for the last half of my trip to work. The road I was on is about 3 to 4 miles long. My experience occurred within a distance of 1,000-ish feet on that road before ending. It was still dark at the time, 6:20 something. My car came with very bright LED headlights and fog lights, and I can see very well in the darkness, as I was driving with all lights on, and I didn't want to hit a deer. On the right side of the road, just a couple hundred feet in front of my car, I saw what looked like a human made out of black mist, but it was dark, so I assumed it was someone just dressed in black. I hit my brakes to make sure I drove by them safely, but as I hit my brakes, the entity disappeared and appeared a couple hundred to a few hundred feet away on the right side again. This is when I know that I was experiencing something paranormal or non-human. I almost got to it before it disappeared again. It appeared a few hundred feet away on the left side of the road. That was the last I saw of it. The best visible description I can give it is a human that is completely black, like a void, with a slight to medium haziness and cloudiness around it. I have had paranormal and other supernatural experiences at my home out in the country and throughout my life. This one did not spook me, but I have never experienced something like this, aside from seeing shadow figures in my home that my family members have also admitted to seeing frequently and in a consistent place in our home. They normally disappear into a doorway as if a spirit is just lurking around and then making their escape from view. Has anyone experienced something similar? Are there widespread sightings like this? Is there a general consensus of what this entity or being is? Thank you in advance for reading and for your potential advice or information. I'm not sure if this is the right place for this experience, but the post here jogged an old hidden memory from my childhood that I now need to get off my chest. In 1999, I was 7 years old, playing in the woods with my friend Charlotte. We were standing at the end of a big log in the woods when I noticed movement in my peripherals. I tried focusing my periphery to catch the detailed look. I see similar movement often when we're in the woods, and always disappears, more like scatters, before I turn to look. My heart skipped a beat when I could make out a group of little people looking up at me as well. I was frozen in the pose I was playing in. After a few seconds, I realized Charlotte had stopped narrating out play and was frozen in place as well, staring at me, but focusing on them. I'm pretty sure they were dressed, because it didn't look like they were all naked. I could tell they knew that we were aware of them, and they dispersed as Charlotte moved her eyes. We didn't talk about it until we were in her house. We weren't afraid, just confused on our walk home. We wrote out what we saw before talking about it to see if we saw the same thing. Unfortunately, both of our descriptions were so vague, but clothed, less than a foot for sure. One thing we were positive of was to mind our business and not go searching, which is what our instincts would have usually been. Duh. We thought we found a colony of little people in the woods, but the fact that our reaction was to quietly leave and not even talk about it until behind closed doors, and still not even talk out loud, but write it. I don't remember being too frightened. In fact, we kind of just accepted it and moved on with a new taste of what this world and universe is capable of. I watched The Indian in the Cupboard later in life, which reminded me of these little people, but I no longer saw them by then. Charlotte and I would talk about seeing things out of the corner of our eyes, but could never figure out what it was. Although Charlotte was different, her and her dad were huge hippies, tire swing in the kitchen, no TV, and her imagination was so wildly magnificent that it made my mind radiate. I always thought that maybe her narration of our play was so powerful and energetic that we could manifest and see the same thing. Little people were never playing any parts in either of our imaginations. In fact, when we both confirmed what each other saw, we were kind of in awe that we never even dreamt of tiny people on this universe. So I'm going to start by saying I'm basically a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal. Although I love hearing stories and listening to other points of view when it comes to that kind of stuff, This is why I'm having such a hard time understanding what happened to me last September. My dad, grandma, grandpa, and I were attending my cousin's wedding in a small rural town just outside of South Haven, Michigan, late last summer. We rented a small house in town, which was located in a very wooded area just off a small lake. Something felt extremely off as soon as I got out of the car at our rental property. That's the best way I could describe it. Something felt off, and I was immediately uneasy. But, being the skeptic that I am, I shrugged it off and chalked it up to being tired and anxious. The night we arrived, my dad and I were having a smoke outside and noticed how weird everything sounded. It was about 11 p.m., and there was no one else around. The trees were cracking incredibly loudly, and we were hearing strange animal noises, but nothing too out of the ordinary. Just the type of animal noises you would hear in rural Michigan, but they just sounded particularly strange to us for some reason. We said our goodnights and went to bed. The next morning, my dad told me that he went outside for a smoke at about 2-ish that morning and heard what sounded to him like someone close by, banging on metal siding. He said it sounded like it was just next door, but didn't hear anything leading up to or preceding the loud banging, like footsteps or anything like that. We shrugged and laughed it off. The second night was when I heard things that I still can't stop thinking about 6 months later. It was about 11 p.m. to midnight, and I was having my last smoke of the night. My grandparents were already asleep, and my dad had just gotten into bed, but still awake, watching TV. I was sitting on the stairs outside with my back to the house, looking straight out into the backyard. I heard someone shout my name in a very abrupt manner, loud and fast. It sounded like they were shouting towards me from the front of the house, like they were standing on the front porch, shouting for me, knowing I was at the back of the house. It sounded just like my dad, but it couldn't be him because I didn't hear the front door open or close or anything. Being a skeptic, I reminded myself to stay calm, and I quickly walked back into the house. My dad was sound asleep. There was no way that by the time I got to him, he could have gotten back into bed. I woke him up, and I asked him if he was outside screaming my name. He looked confused and said of course not. I started to get really freaked out at this point. I tried to go back to bed, but I couldn't get that scream out of my head. I was up all night trying to figure out what happened. I was honestly contemplating leaving, getting a hotel room somewhere close by, and returning in the morning. Miraculously, I must have fallen asleep sometime around 3 a.m. We woke up the next morning, and I was so ready to get the hell out of that town. As soon as we left, the uneasy feeling I had the entire weekend disappeared. When I returned to work the next day, I told my coworker the weird experience I had. Her face immediately dropped. She proceeded to inform me that this is quite common in the Appalachian area regarding cryptids and other types of creatures. Apparently they try to get your attention by mimicking someone close to you, and when you look at them, they kidnap you, or something along those lines. But I was in Michigan. I tried to look up the information about the town I was in, but I didn't find anything remotely interesting. Has anyone else had a similar experience? Back when I was a security guard, I used to work the graveyard shift. It was a crap assignment that had me driving 30 minutes both ways for 10 an hour, so I didn't stick around long. Anyways, at this time of night, there would rarely be anyone else there. Sometimes a worker or two would come back around midnight with a rental car after having been on some business trip, and they'd give me the keys before taking their own car home. Most of the time, though, I was completely alone in a big facility with a connected, abandoned office. The office was pretty chilling to walk through, but in my last weeks working there, I never had any issues in there. There was a bunch of construction going on in the middle of the building, though, a few hundred yards from the security office, and I often had to go into this giant concrete room to check on a water leak that had started. I didn't think anything of it, and was glad for the chance to get out of the office beyond my usual patrols. I checked this room during my patrols as well, and one time, after I'd passed through that room and started walking down the hall, I could have sworn I heard a blood-curdling scream some ways down the hall behind me. I turned on my heels and grabbed my radio. We carried one with us and left one at the main entrance for anyone to use if they had to call us over. I called out over the radio for anyone who just entered the building to pick up the radio and talk to me right away. I repeated this a few times, walking down the hall and swinging my light around. I didn't hear the noise again, and no one answered me, so I wrapped up that patrol and went back to the security office. I checked the cameras, and sure enough, no one had entered while I'd been walking around. This happened to me a few times during my last shifts, and it always unsettled me. So I was much happier taking the upstairs patrol route, because even though the upstairs and penthouse were creepier, I'd never heard what I thought to be a ghost lady screaming up there. I didn't interact with the company that used the building much, besides sending them emails about patrol findings, but I decided to reach out to one of the guys who actually liked us lowly security guards and asked him if he knew anything. I thought I would sound crazy to him, but when I described the sound and where it was in the hallway beside the room with the leaking pipe, he told me that people heard it during the day as well. It turned out to be just some water from elsewhere in the building that was being diverted to the pipes in the hallway, because that's what had been causing the leak in the concrete room. I never got an explanation about the scream I heard in the cordoned-off room directly behind the security office one night, but I left for a better-paying job before I cared to go down that rabbit hole. From what the security supervisor told me when we were discussing the construction before this all happened, he told me that it used to be an infirmary, mostly for employees who had been exposed to radiation, actually a viable occupational risk there. I don't think I heard some radioactive zombie. I just never figured out what that noise could have been. Some backstory. My parents split when I was about 14. It wasn't a good breakup. My dad was an abusive drug addict. So when my mom left him, she was in a really bad place. Her and my older sister was in her 20s and in full-blown party mode, kept taking her to local bars since my mom was depressed. This led my mom to becoming an alcoholic, since my sister was well on her way to becoming one too. During one of these nights, she met a guy. I didn't know much about him, just that they met him and his brother at a bar, and now she was dating him. It went pretty fast, and my sister would flirt with the brother to get free food and drinks from him. Around this time, I was about 15, and this dude just seemed off. He was probably early 40s or so, and he was always going on my mom's dates with his brother. He just kind of hung around a lot. One day, my sister decided she wanted sushi and called the brother up to take us, because she knew he would pay. I did not want to go, but we didn't have food in the house, and I was hungry. We didn't have a sushi place in our town, so we had to drive to the city, which was about 30 minutes away. The entire ride, I just had this warning feeling in my stomach that kept telling me to get out of the car, that this was a bad idea. I was a giant ball of anxiety the whole 30 minutes. My sister sat in the front seat, completely oblivious to what was happening. Meanwhile, I kept catching him staring at me in the rearview mirror. Once we got to the restaurant, he sat himself directly across from me. He wanted to sit next to me, but I rushed to sit next to my sister instead. It was awkward, but my sister talked a lot, so I was able to kind of hide. Eventually, she got up to go to the bathroom, and then I was alone with him. Almost immediately, he asked me if I had a boyfriend, and I said no.
That's good,
he said.
You're too good for high school boys. They're only after one thing.
I just nodded, not knowing what to say. He then went on to ask if I liked Disneyland, and I said yes. He got excited and went on about how he would take me, but hotels were expensive, so we'd have to share a room. It would just be us, so my mom and his brother could be alone. He said my sister couldn't come, though, because he couldn't afford to pay for both of us to go. At this point, I was extremely uncomfortable, and I just wanted my sister to come back. She finally did, and he switched to just talking to her. She didn't notice anything was wrong, or that he kept looking at me. Once we finished, he took us home and invited himself in. I went to my room, locked the door, and hid. At one point, someone tried to open the door, but they stopped once they felt it was locked. My mom and her boyfriend came home around then. I tried talking to my sister, but she brushed me off. They had invited us back to their house, and I wanted so badly to stay home, but they forced me to go. Almost immediately, my mom and her boyfriend went to the room and left my sister and I with him. He got my sister drunk pretty fast and tried to get me to drink, but I kept refusing. It got to the point where my sister was almost blacked out drunk, and I was freaking out because when she passed out, it would be just us. I started texting my brothers, hoping one of them would pick me up. Thank God, my eldest brother responded. I told him what was happening, and he came to get me. He showed up and told the guy that it was late, and I had school, so he was taking me home. He tried to protest, but my brother was very firm about it. He loaded my sister in the car, texted my mom he was taking us home, and then we left. My brother didn't live with us since he was about 30 at the time and had his own family, so he didn't know what was going on. I told him the full story, and he got real quiet, and then waited till my mom got home. He told her off, shamed her for putting me in that situation, and told her that if it continued, he would move me into his house. My mom broke down then and told him she wanted to break up with her boyfriend because of his brother. I found out when I was older that he would sneak by the door to listen to them when they had sex. I think more happened, but my mom never talked about it more than that. She broke up with him, got a good job, and sobered up with the help of my brother. It took my sister a lot longer, but she eventually got her life together. So, to the creepy brother of my mom's ex-boyfriend, let's not meet again. This incident occurred this last spring. Let me set the scene and give a bit of backstory. I was driving from Minnesota to Iowa for a music festival and decided to leave Thursday night because 1, I generally prefer road tripping at night, less vehicles on the road, etc. And 2, I wanted to get to the festival grounds as early as possible to secure a good camping spot. All is going well. I'm about 2 hours away from Des Moines, and I realize that I really gotta pee. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with driving long, mostly rural interstate highways, rest areas can be a godsend when the gas stations, especially ones still open after midnight, are few and far between. So I see a sign for a rest area coming up in 2 miles. Perfect. I pull in, and there's maybe 3 other cars in the lot. Things are generally quiet, and on first glance, nothing seems out of the ordinary or anything. However, I have just a general feeling of unease as I pull in to park, and I'm not one to ignore my intuitive reaction to things, but I really just have to freaking pee. Luckily, my little brother had just given me this badass little taser, because he knows how often I like to go adventuring in various wooded areas and whatnot, usually at night, and he wants me to be safe. So, I grab it quick and run in to use the bathroom. Not 30 seconds after I close my stall door, I'm the only one in the building, by the way, I hear someone yelling either babe or a name, but it's unintelligible. Just the way they were hollering made them sound unstable. At this point, my heart starts beating pretty fast, and I'm just hoping he leaves the general building, but no. I hear the main door to the women's restrooms get kicked open, and of course, he comes to the only stall door that is shut and starts kind of mumble yelling something that I can't make out. And I just said, in my sternest possible voice, "Dude, what the F?" He finally says something I can make out.
"I'm looking for my effing girlfriend."
So I said, "You don't know me, get the fuck out." And he proceeds to ask me my name. Like, what the fuck? Dude is clearly not in his right mind. And at this point, he starts shaking my freaking stall door. So I turned on the taser and repeated, "Get out," before hitting the little button that makes the taser do its thing. Luckily, as I'd hoped, just the sound of it was enough for him to quickly and repeatedly apologize as he backed his way out of the bathrooms. I just sat there for like 10 minutes as I regained control of my composure and then quickly walked out to my vehicle, taser at the ready, and booked it out of there immediately. This happened about 8 years ago, and I still think about it on the occasion and wonder what the fuck happened. The summer between my freshman and sophomore of high school, there was this boy that I liked. Being teenagers, we would sneak out in the middle of the night to this park that was really close to our houses. One night, at about 2 in the morning, we were sitting on a picnic table on one end of the park, like we normally would. We did this for months, and it was like any other night. This park is surrounded 3/4 of the way by canyons, and the park has a playground, soccer fields, and a baseball field. We were just hanging out, and we saw 2 people, a man probably in his 30s, a little heavyset, wearing a red baseball cap and a white t-shirt, and a woman who was a bit younger than him. The boy I was with and I watched the 2 of them walk across the baseball fields and into the canyon. We didn't think anything of it. Maybe they were just going to have relations in the canyon. I don't know, some people did that. Maybe 5 minutes later, and we started to hear screaming. I was not going crazy, because it startled the boy I was with too. It was nothing like I'd ever heard. The screaming was ear-piercing and absolutely horrifying. After about 20 seconds, everything fell silent. We didn't hear anything, but a little while later, maybe a few minutes, the man came walking back out of the canyon, but without the girl. He started walking towards where we were sitting, and we just dipped. We got the hell out of there. We grabbed all of our stuff and ran home. I don't know if he saw us, but we were not sticking around to find out. It was quite dark, so it wouldn't surprise me if he didn't notice anyone was there until he saw 2 teenagers taking off through the playground. For the next 2 to 3 months, I looked all over the internet and would go look around the canyon for anything to explain what happened. I never found anything, online or in the canyon, and I still have no idea what happened that night. This is probably one of the scariest and creepiest things that has ever happened to me. I would also like to say I was about 14 or 15 when this happened and was a selfish teenager preoccupied with himself. So no, I didn't call the police. I should have. I think back on it and beat myself up for not saying anything. But at the time, I was only concerned about getting in trouble for sneaking out with a boy. If this happened today, I would for sure call the police.